The night I was promoted was supposed to be the happiest moment of my life, but instead, it became the night my marriage quietly collapsed in front of everyone I trusted. Jason stood just a few feet away from me at the company celebration, his voice calm but sharp as he said, "She didn't earn this promotion." And in the worst part, his family didn't hesitate. They nodded, like they had been waiting to say it for years, like my years of late nights, skipped dinners, and 6 zero-hour work weeks meant nothing at all. I remember the exact moment the room changed, the way the applause faded into awkward silence, the way people started avoiding my eyes like I had suddenly become a mistake they didn't want to be connected to. But what they didn't know, what none of them in that room could even imagine, was that the company they were standing in, the company they were judging me inside, had already quietly been placed under my controlling authority months ago, signed, verified, and legally transferred in ways they never bothered to check. If this story resonates with you, take a second to like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. It really means a lot and helps me know where these stories reach the most. My name is Olivia Carter. I'm 32 years old. And what happened that night didn't just change my job title. It changed the way I saw everyone I thought I could trust, because that was the night my husband looked at me like I was nothing, in front of everyone who believed him, and yet none of them realized they were standing inside a truth that had already been written long before they decided to speak against me. And before that night, before the silence, before the humiliation, everything started in a place I never expected to become the center of my entire life. It started long before that night, long before anyone in that room decided they had the right to judge me. And if I am honest, I think I always knew something was wrong about the way people looked at me in that company, as if I had somehow arrived at success without paying the cost everyone else believed they had earned. I still remember the first time I joined Hayes Corporation 8 years ago. I was not someone with a loud voice or a powerful family name. I was just a project analyst sitting in a corner office on the 7th floor, with a laptop that overheated every afternoon and a calendar filled with deadlines that never seemed to end. Jason and I were already married by then, and at the beginning, he used to be proud of me in a quiet way, the kind of pride that does not need an audience, but over time that changed, slowly at first, like a conversation you do not notice fading until there is nothing left to hear. The company itself was large, almost overwhelming at times. Glass walls, polished floors, meetings that stretched for hours, and executives who spoke in numbers that always felt just slightly out of reach for most employees. I worked late most nights, sometimes leaving the building at 10:30 in the evening when the city lights outside looked softer than the fluorescent ones inside, and I would often see Jason already home, sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone, asking me in a tone that sounded casual but carried something heavier underneath. Questions like why I was still at work, or why I needed to stay so late when others seemed to manage with less effort. I never answered with frustration. I just explained, because I believed effort would eventually speak for itself. But what I did not realize was how quietly narratives form around people when they are not in the room. The first real shift happened about 2 years ago during a quarterly performance review meeting on the 14th floor, when Robert Hayes, the chief executive officer, asked me to stay behind after everyone else left. The room was unusually quiet then, the kind of silence that makes you aware of every small movement, the faint hum of air conditioning, the distant sound of elevators, and the soft tap of my own shoes as I turned back toward the table. He did not speak immediately. He just looked at a folder in front of him, then at me, then back at the folder again, as if measuring something that did not need to be spoken out loud. "You have been consistent," he said finally, in a tone that was not praise but recognition. And that was the moment I first noticed something shift in how he treated me. Not as an employee who simply completed tasks, but as someone whose decisions carried weight beyond her title. Around the same time, Jason began to change in ways that were harder to define. Not sudden, not dramatic, but subtle enough that I questioned myself before I questioned him. He started attending more family dinners without me, talking more often with his mother Karen about company matters that had nothing to do with his actual role, and asking me fewer questions about my work while making more statements about how things should be run. I remember one evening in particular when I came home at almost 11 o'clock, my shoes still in my hand because I did not want to make noise, and I found him in the kitchen speaking quietly with his father William, their voices low, not angry, but deliberate, like they were discussing something important they assumed I did not need to hear. When I entered, the conversation stopped instantly, and that silence told me more than the words ever could. At work, however, things were different, or at least they seemed different on the surface. I was assigned to lead a restructuring project for one of the company's most important divisions, a responsibility that normally went to senior executives, not mid-level managers, but Robert insisted it was the right move. "You see patterns others miss," he told me once during a late meeting, sliding a document across the table without looking up. "That is rare here." I did not fully understand what he meant at the time, but I remember the way HR Director Mark Sullivan reacted whenever my name appeared in internal reports, a brief pause, a second glance, as if checking something that was not part of the standard process. Still, I never questioned it deeply, because in environments like that, when things move upward too quickly, you tend to assume it is merit rather than structure. The first time I felt something closer to unease was during a financial oversight meeting, when I was asked to sign off on a set of documents that involved asset allocation across multiple subsidiaries. Jason was in the room that day, sitting slightly behind me, not speaking, just watching. I remember how carefully Mark placed the papers in front of me, how his hand hesitated for a fraction of a second before sliding them forward, and how Robert, standing near the window, did not intervene but simply observed. Jason leaned in slightly and whispered, "Just sign it. Everyone already agreed." There was something in his voice that sounded certain, but also rehearsed, like he had already decided the outcome before I had even read the first page. I signed because I trusted systems more than suspicion, and because at that time I still believed marriage meant alignment, that what benefited him and what benefited me were not separate things. It was only later, months after that meeting, that I began noticing how certain conversations stopped when I entered rooms, how certain emails were copied to me but not explained, how certain decisions seemed to move forward even when I had not been fully informed. Yet every time I asked, I was met with calm reassurance, not defensiveness, just enough comfort to make doubt feel unnecessary. Jason was the most consistent voice in those moments, always telling me I was overthinking, always reminding me that the company was stable, that Robert trusted me, that I should not complicate things that were already working. And slowly, without realizing it, I began to accept silence as agreement. The promotion itself came on a Tuesday morning in early spring, announced in a general leadership meeting where no one clapped immediately, not because they disagreed, but because they were calculating what it meant. Robert announced it with the same calm tone he used for all major decisions, and I remember Jason's face that moment, not surprised, not happy, just still, as if he had expected something else, but was willing to accept this version of reality for now. That was also when I first noticed how many people avoided meeting my eyes directly afterward, as if looking at me too long might imply alignment with a decision they were not prepared to defend later. Jason congratulated me in private that evening, but his words felt distant, like they belonged to someone who had already started stepping away from me emotionally, long before physically doing so. I did not know it then, but that was the beginning of a shift I would not fully understand until everything collapsed into that single room where silence replaced trust and observation replaced truth. The turning point began in a way so quiet that at first I did not even recognize it as the beginning of anything important, because in companies like Hayes Corporation, silence often looks like routine, and routine often hides decisions that change everything. It was a Wednesday afternoon when I was called into a closed-door meeting on the 14th floor, the same floor where most executive decisions were made, and the air always felt slightly different there, as if conversations carried more weight simply because of the carpet beneath your feet. Robert Hayes was already inside when I arrived, standing near the glass window that overlooked the city, his hands folded behind his back in that familiar posture he used when he was thinking rather than speaking. Mark Sullivan from HR was seated at the long table, and Jason was there as well, which immediately made something inside me tighten in a way I could not explain at the time. No one greeted me with warmth, not because they were unfriendly, but because the atmosphere did not allow it, as if the room itself had already decided this was not a social conversation. Robert finally turned around and gestured for me to sit, and I noticed a folder placed directly in front of my seat, thick enough that its presence alone felt significant. "We are finalizing internal structural alignment," Robert said calmly, his voice steady and controlled, the kind of tone that made everything sound already decided before it was explained. Jason did not look at me, not once, and instead kept his eyes on the table, tapping his fingers lightly in a rhythm that felt more like a distraction than a habit. Mark opened the folder and began sliding documents forward, each page neatly printed, each line filled with corporate language that felt distant and mechanical. I remember reading phrases like equity adjustment, governance restructuring, and authority consolidation, but what stood out most was not what was written, but what was missing: clarity. I asked a simple question: what exactly am I signing? And the room did not respond immediately. That pause lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough for me to notice Jason shifting slightly in his chair, as if he already knew the answer but did not want to say it. Robert finally spoke again, saying that it was a standard procedural update tied to my new role, and Mark added that it was part of a long-planned internal transition that would ensure smoother executive operations. Jason then leaned forward slightly and said, almost too casually, "It is better this way, trust me." That was the first time I felt something underneath his voice that did not feel like support, but like direction, as if he was guiding me toward a conclusion that had already been chosen without me. I signed the documents that day, not because I fully understood them, but because every authority in the room was aligned in agreement, and when everyone agrees, doubt becomes something you question in yourself rather than in them. After the meeting ended, Robert left first, followed by Mark, leaving Jason and me alone in the room for a brief moment that felt heavier than the entire conversation we had just had. He finally looked at me then, but his expression was unreadable, not soft, not harsh, just distant, in a way that made me feel like I was speaking to someone who had already stepped out of the relationship without telling me. "You are doing the right thing," he said quietly, and then he left before I could respond. Days passed after that meeting, and nothing appeared to change on the surface, but I began noticing small shifts that were easy to dismiss individually but impossible to ignore collectively. Emails that used to include me now arrived with my name copied but no real input requested. Meetings where I had once spoken were now summarized instead of discussed, and people who used to wait for my approval began speaking as if my presence was informational rather than influential. Jason became more distant at home, spending longer hours away and returning with the same calm expression that gave away nothing. When I asked him if something was wrong, he would smile faintly and say everything was fine, that I was imagining tension where there was only work pressure. But I was not imagining it. I could feel it in the way conversations ended too quickly when I entered rooms, in the way phone calls stopped mid-sentence, and in the way people avoided confirming things they had previously confirmed with me directly. The first real sign that something was fundamentally wrong came when I tried to approve a project budget I had always handled before, only to be told by Mark's assistant that I no longer had authorization for final approval on that category. I remember standing there for a moment, holding the printed report, staring at a sentence that essentially said my signature was no longer sufficient for decisions I used to control. When I asked why, the response was polite but vague, referencing internal restructuring and updated governance protocols, the kind of explanation that sounds official but reveals nothing. That night, I brought it up to Jason again, and instead of answering directly, he simply said, "These things happen when companies scale. Do not take it personally." But I was taking it personally because it was my work, my decisions, and slowly, my voice inside the company was being replaced by something I was not part of. Still, I told myself it was temporary, a transition phase, something that would stabilize once the new structure was fully in place. I held on to that belief longer than I should have, because believing it allowed me to continue functioning without questioning the foundation beneath me. What I did not know then was that the structure was already complete, and I was no longer standing inside the version of the company I thought I was part of, but inside a system that had already quietly moved past me without announcing the moment it happened. The change became undeniable the moment I walked into the office on a Monday morning and realized that no one was waiting for me the way they used to, not because I was late or early, but because my arrival no longer carried the same weight it once did. The glass doors of Hayes Corporation opened as usual. The security guard nodded politely as he always did. The elevator moved upward with its familiar mechanical hum, yet something felt different in the way people looked at me when I stepped onto the executive floor. Conversations did not stop anymore when I entered. They simply shifted slightly, continuing as if my presence was now part of the background instead of the center. I remember seeing Emily Brooks at the copy machine, someone who used to greet me every morning without fail, but that day she hesitated, offered a small, polite smile, and then looked away almost immediately, as if unsure whether she was still supposed to treat me the same way. It was a small moment, but it stayed with me longer than I expected. When I reached my office, I found Mark Sullivan already inside, sitting across from my desk with a folder placed neatly in front of him. He did not stand when I entered, which was unusual, because he always used to stand as a form of respect during our earlier meetings. Instead, he remained seated and gestured slightly toward the chair across from him, as if we were equals in conversation rather than roles in hierarchy. "There have been updates to internal structure execution," he said calmly, sliding the folder toward me. The language immediately triggered something familiar, the same type of phrasing I had heard weeks earlier when things began to shift, carefully constructed sentences that sounded official but revealed nothing concrete. I opened the folder and began reading, slowly at first, then again more carefully, because what I was seeing did not align with what I believed my position still was inside the company. Several of my previous responsibilities were now marked as reassigned, not to individuals I recognized, but to roles labeled under executive oversight committees and interim governance boards. My access to certain financial review systems had been reduced, and my approval authority for project escalation was no longer listed under my name. I looked up at Mark, expecting clarification, but his expression remained unchanged, professional and neutral, the kind of neutrality that does not invite argument. I asked him directly what this meant for my role, and he responded with a prepared explanation about optimization, alignment, and operational restructuring designed to improve efficiency. It was not an answer, it was a shield. I left that meeting without raising my voice, but internally something had already begun to shift, because confusion has a way of turning into suspicion when it is not resolved. Later that afternoon, I went to see Robert Hayes, expecting clarity from the one person who had always spoken with the most direct authority. His office on the top floor always felt slightly removed from the rest of the building, quieter, almost insulated from the rest of the company noise. When I entered, he was not surprised to see me, which in itself felt like information I did not yet know how to interpret. He asked me to sit, then leaned back in his chair, observing me in a way that felt less like evaluation and more like confirmation of something already decided. I asked him why my responsibilities were being reassigned without discussion, and he took a moment before responding, choosing his words carefully. "Nothing is being taken from you," he said. "It is being redistributed for structural clarity." But I had worked in corporate environments long enough to understand that redistribution often meant removal of influence without removal of title. Before I could press further, Jason entered the room, closing the door behind him with a quiet finality that immediately changed the atmosphere. He looked at me briefly, then at Robert, and then chose a seat slightly behind and to the side, not next to me as he once would have. That detail alone told me more than either of them had said so far. Robert continued speaking, explaining that leadership roles within the company were being redefined to ensure stability during expansion, and that certain decision-making authorities were being centralized. Jason finally spoke then, and his tone was calm, almost practiced, as if he had already rehearsed this conversation in his mind. "This is not personal," he said. "It is necessary for the next stage of growth." I remember looking at him directly at that moment, searching for something familiar in his expression, but I did not find it. Instead, I saw distance, not emotional distance, but structural distance, like he had already placed himself on a different side of a decision I was still trying to understand. I asked him if he realized what this meant for my work, for my position, for everything I had built over nearly a decade, and he responded with a short pause before saying, "You will still be part of the company, just not in the same capacity." That sentence should have sounded reassuring, but instead it felt like a quiet conclusion. I left Robert's office shortly after that, walking through the hallway in a way that felt slightly unfamiliar, as if the building itself was no longer aligned with my direction. People passed me without stopping, and I noticed for the first time that no one was checking in with me for decisions anymore. No one was asking for approvals. No one was waiting for input. It was not abrupt. It was gradual enough that it could be explained away by busy schedules or shifting priorities, but consistent enough that it could no longer be ignored. That evening, Jason came home later than usual, and when I asked him directly if something was happening that I was not being told, he did not deny it, but instead said I was overthinking changes that were normal in corporate transitions. Yet the silence that followed felt heavier than his words. I sat alone in the kitchen long after he went upstairs, thinking about every conversation from the past few weeks, every meeting, every document I had signed without realizing the full context, and for the first time I began to consider the possibility that nothing I had experienced was accidental. It was not chaos, it was design, and I had been inside it long enough to mistake structure for stability. The following morning felt heavier than the ones before it, not because anything loud or dramatic happened, but because silence itself had started to take up more space than words ever did. I arrived at Hayes Corporation just before 8:30, as I always had for years. Yet for the first time, I noticed no one was expecting me in the same way. No one was waiting with questions, no one approaching my office with urgency that used to define my days. The elevator ride to the executive floor was quiet, except for the soft mechanical movement, and I remember staring at the reflection of my own face in the metal doors, trying to recognize whether anything about me had changed or if it was everything around me that had shifted instead. When I stepped out, I saw two unfamiliar assistants standing near what used to be my administrative area, and they paused briefly when they saw me, exchanging a glance that lasted just long enough for me to notice before one of them politely informed me that certain office allocations had been updated and I would now be working from a different section. There was no apology in her voice, only procedure, as if I was being informed of a scheduled maintenance change rather than a professional reassignment. My new office was smaller, located further down the corridor, with less natural light and fewer visible signs of executive activity. It was still technically on the same floor, but the difference felt intentional, like a quiet repositioning rather than an upgrade or a coincidence. I placed my bag down and sat for a moment, listening to the unfamiliar quiet of the space, before opening my laptop and attempting to log into the internal project dashboard. That was when I noticed the first complete restriction. My credentials no longer allowed access to strategic planning files. At first, I assumed it was a temporary system update, something IT would resolve quickly, but after multiple attempts and the same denied access message repeating on the screen, I felt something tighten in my chest that I could not immediately name. I picked up my phone and called Mark Sullivan directly, but the call went to voicemail. I then sent an internal message asking for clarification, and within minutes I received a short reply stating that access permissions had been adjusted according to current governance structure and that further details would be available through formal channels if necessary. There was no explanation beyond that. I sat back in my chair and looked at the screen for a long moment, noticing how quickly a system can feel unfamiliar when the rules inside it change without warning. Around midday, Jason finally called me, which in itself had become less frequent over the past several days. His tone was calm, almost neutral, and he asked if I was at the office. When I confirmed, he said he wanted to meet briefly after work to discuss something important. There was no warmth in his voice, only scheduling. I agreed without hesitation, because at that point refusing would not have changed anything except delay what was already unfolding. The rest of the day passed in fragments, short meetings where my input was not requested, emails where I was informed rather than consulted, and passing conversations that no longer paused when I entered the room. It was as if I had become a known presence that no longer required acknowledgement. By the time evening arrived, I was more observant than involved, watching patterns instead of participating in them, and noticing how often Mark and Jason appeared in the same spaces without ever directly including me in decisions that affected my own role. When I left the building that night, Jason was already waiting in the parking area, leaning against his car in a way that felt casual but distant, like someone preparing to deliver information rather than share a conversation. We drove in silence for several minutes before he finally spoke, saying that things were progressing faster than expected and that certain decisions had to be finalized to stabilize internal operations. I asked him directly what that meant for me, and he hesitated just long enough for me to understand that whatever answer came next had already been decided elsewhere. He said my role would continue to exist in title, but operational authority would be centralized under executive control until further notice. The phrasing was careful, almost rehearsed, and I remember asking him if he realized what that actually meant in practice, because titles without authority are not positions, they are labels. He did not respond immediately, keeping his eyes on the road, before finally saying that this was not personal and that I should trust the process. That word, trust, felt different coming from him now, not like reassurance, but like instruction. When we arrived home, he did not come inside right away, instead staying in the car for a moment, and I could see him looking at his phone before finally stepping out. Inside the house, everything felt normal in appearance, but nothing felt aligned anymore. I sat at the kitchen table long after he went upstairs, thinking about the documents I had signed weeks earlier, the meetings where decisions were made in silence, and the gradual removal of my authority that no one had explicitly announced, but everyone had quietly accepted. I opened my laptop again and tried accessing internal records through a different pathway, and that was when I noticed something I had missed before. A set of updated governance notes referencing ownership structure review, pending final confirmation, with my name listed in a category that did not match any previous classification I had ever seen. It was not removal, not promotion, but something in between that did not yet have a clear definition. And in that moment, I realized the most unsettling part was not what I had lost, but how long the system had been moving without telling me where it was ultimately heading. The moment I decided something was truly wrong was not when I lost access, not when my authority started disappearing from internal systems, but when I realized no one was even pretending anymore that I still had influence inside the company I helped build. It was a Friday morning when I arrived at Hayes Corporation and noticed an unusual meeting invitation already waiting in my inbox, marked as mandatory but without any explanation. No agenda, no subject details, only a time, a room number, and the names of people attending, most of whom I no longer directly worked with. When I entered the conference room on the 14th floor, I immediately felt the difference in atmosphere, not hostility, not warmth, but something colder and more structured, like I had walked into a conversation that had already finished before I arrived. Robert Hayes was seated at the head of the table, as always, but this time Jason was beside him instead of near me, and that single physical distance felt more meaningful than any sentence spoken so far. Mark Sullivan was present again, along with two board advisors I rarely saw, and a legal representative I had never met before, which immediately made my stomach tighten because legal presence in corporate meetings rarely meant routine discussion. No one greeted me directly when I sat down. They simply acknowledged my arrival with brief glances before returning their attention to the documents already arranged in front of them. Robert spoke first, calmly explaining that this meeting was part of a formal review of internal governance structure and that certain clarifications were needed regarding operational control and decision authority distribution. His voice was steady, measured, almost careful, as if every word had been reviewed before being spoken out loud. I remember Jason looking at me briefly at that moment, not with emotion, but with something closer to resignation, as if he had already accepted a version of this conversation that I had not yet been given access to. The legal representative then opened a folder and began reading clauses related to authority consolidation and shareholder verification, terms that sounded abstract, until I heard my own name appear in the context of ownership confirmation procedures. That was when I leaned forward slightly and asked what exactly was being reviewed, and the room paused just long enough for me to understand that whatever answer came next had already been agreed upon elsewhere. Robert explained that due to ongoing structural evaluation, certain historical documentation required clarification, particularly regarding equity assignment and controlling interest validation within Hayes Corporation subsidiaries. He did not raise his voice. He did not appear aggressive, but the precision of his language made it clear that this was not a discussion. It was a formalization of something already in motion. Mark then placed a second document on the table, sliding it toward me with careful hands, and said that there had been an internal discrepancy flagged during compliance verification. Jason finally spoke again, and this time his voice was quieter than before, almost detached, as he said that there had been misunderstandings regarding the extent of my operational authority, and that those misunderstandings needed to be corrected for legal clarity. I looked at him directly, trying to find something familiar in his expression, but what I saw instead was distance that felt deliberate, not emotional confusion, but structural separation, like he had already positioned himself on the other side of a decision I was still being introduced to. The legal representative continued speaking, explaining that certain approvals I had signed months earlier were now under review due to overlapping authority channels, and that until verification was complete, my access to executive decision systems would remain restricted. I asked if this meant my position itself was under question, and Robert responded carefully, saying that my role remained valid, but classification within the company's governance hierarchy was being reassessed for accuracy. The wording was precise enough to avoid direct implication, but vague enough to remove certainty. Jason did not look at me when I asked him directly if he had known about this process before today, and his silence lasted just long enough to feel intentional. When he finally answered, he said he had been informed of structural adjustments but not involved in the final legal interpretation, a response that sounded careful rather than complete. The meeting ended without resolution, only with the statement that further confirmation would follow through official channels once the review process was complete. I left the room before anyone else spoke again, walking down the hallway in a state that felt unusually quiet, not because there was no noise, but because nothing I heard seemed to belong to me anymore. Back at my office, I found that my name had been removed from several internal leadership boards that had previously listed me as a core decision contributor, replaced with interim placeholders and committee designations that did not include my direct participation. I sat there for a long time without speaking, reading the same changes repeatedly, not because I did not understand them, but because I was trying to understand when understanding had stopped being part of the process. That evening, when Jason came home, I asked him again what was really happening, and this time his answer was slower, more measured, as if he was choosing each word carefully to avoid breaking something that was already breaking. He said I was still part of the company, but that I needed to trust that the structure being put in place was necessary for long-term stability, and I remember realizing in that moment that trust was no longer being offered as reassurance, but demanded as acceptance. And for the first time, I understood that the company had not been slowly changing around me. It had already changed completely, and I was only now being informed that I was no longer standing inside the version of it I believed I owned. The days that followed the meeting did not feel like collapse all at once, but rather like a controlled dismantling of everything I had once believed was stable, each morning revealing a slightly different version of my professional identity being reduced without anyone ever saying the word removed. When I arrived at Hayes Corporation on Monday, my access badge still worked, the elevator still brought me to the executive floor, and my office was still physically mine, but the structure around me had already shifted so far that the physical space no longer matched the professional reality I remembered. I noticed it first in the way meeting invitations stopped arriving automatically, replaced instead by vague notifications marked as optional or informational, language that sounded harmless but effectively excluded me from decision-making processes I had once led. That morning, I walked past the main conference room and saw Jason inside through the glass walls, sitting at the table with Robert Hayes and Mark Sullivan, reviewing documents that I had not been invited to see. Jason glanced up briefly as I passed, and for a fraction of a second our eyes met, but there was no signal in his expression, no acknowledgement of shared understanding, only the neutral look of someone observing a situation they had already accepted. I continued walking, but something inside me tightened, because exclusion in silence feels different than exclusion in conflict. It feels finalized without announcement. When I reached my office, I found Emily Brooks waiting outside, holding a small stack of printed reports that used to be routed through me directly. She hesitated when she saw me, then politely informed me that reporting channels had been updated and that future submissions would need to go through centralized review before distribution. Her tone was careful, as if she was afraid of saying too much or too little, and when I asked who had authorized the change, she simply said it came from Executive Compliance Directive. I opened the reports and immediately noticed that my name was no longer listed in the approval chain, replaced instead by a generic committee label that did not reference my position or authority. I spent the next hour attempting to access internal dashboards that had once been essential to my daily work, only to find multiple authentication failures and permission restrictions that had not existed the week before. Each error message felt less like a technical issue and more like a quiet confirmation that my presence in the system was being rewritten in real time. Around midday, Mark Sullivan requested a brief meeting in a smaller conference room on the same floor, a space usually reserved for administrative adjustments rather than executive discussions. When I arrived, he was already there with a single folder in front of him, and his demeanor was unchanged, calm, procedural, almost detached. He explained that an internal audit process was underway to ensure governance alignment across all operational tiers, and that during this period, certain roles would experience temporary recalibration of authority levels. I asked him directly if this meant my position was being downgraded, and he responded without hesitation that it was not about ranking, but about structural clarity. That answer, although carefully phrased, did not address the reality of what I was experiencing, because clarity without function is still removal of influence. After the meeting, I returned to my office and tried calling Jason, but he did not answer immediately, and when he finally called back, his voice sounded distant, as if he was speaking from a place mentally removed from the conversation itself. I asked him what was happening, and there was a long pause before he responded, saying that I needed to understand this was a necessary step for long-term corporate stability and that resistance would only create unnecessary tension. I remember sitting there listening to him, realizing that he was not trying to convince me anymore. He was trying to explain a conclusion that had already been finalized without me. That evening, I stayed late in the office longer than usual, not because I had work to complete, but because leaving felt like acknowledging something I was not ready to accept. The building gradually emptied around me, lights dimming across different sections of the floor, until only a few remained active in distant offices. I walked through the hallway slowly, noticing how the company still functioned perfectly without my participation, how systems continued, meetings continued, decisions continued, all without interruption. It was not chaos that replaced me, it was continuity. When I finally returned home, Jason was already there, sitting at the kitchen table reviewing documents on his laptop. He looked up briefly when I entered but did not pause his work immediately, which itself felt like a change from how things used to be. I asked him again, directly, whether he had known about the changes happening to my role before they were implemented, and this time his answer came faster, but not clearer. He said he knew there were discussions happening about restructuring but insisted he was not involved in the details, only informed at a high level after decisions were made. I studied his face as he spoke, looking for hesitation, guilt, or uncertainty, but what I saw instead was something more difficult to interpret, a calm acceptance that no longer required emotional alignment. I told him that I was being removed from systems I had built, from decisions I had led, from authority that used to define my position, and he replied that the company was evolving and that roles naturally shift in that process. That word, shift, felt too soft for what was happening, because nothing about what I was experiencing felt like movement within a system I still belonged to. Later that night, after he went to bed, I sat alone in the living room and opened my laptop again, reviewing every document I could still access, tracing back approvals, structural notes, governance updates, and internal communications until a pattern began to emerge that I had not noticed before. My involvement had not been suddenly removed. It had been gradually reclassified, step by step, decision by decision, until my authority existed only in name while operational control had been quietly centralized elsewhere. And in that realization, the most unsettling truth was not that I had lost influence, but that the system had been designed in such a way that I would continue participating in it long after I stopped being part of its power. The message I received that morning was short, almost indifferent, but it changed the entire direction of everything I thought I still controlled inside Hayes Corporation, because it informed me that a final executive review meeting had been scheduled for that afternoon, and attendance was required from all senior stakeholders involved in governance clarification. There was no explanation beyond that, no agenda attached, no indication of what exactly would be discussed, only a time, a location, and a list of names that immediately made my stomach tighten when I saw Jason's name included alongside Robert Hayes, Mark Sullivan, and several board members I had never interacted with directly. I arrived at the top-floor conference room exactly on time, but for the first time I noticed something I had never paid attention to before, which was how the room itself seemed to have been arranged in a way that subtly separated me from everyone else, not physically isolated, but positioned in a way that made my seat feel like observation rather than participation. Jason was already there when I walked in, speaking quietly with Robert, and when he saw me, he stopped for a fraction of a second before nodding once, not warmly, not coldly, just neutrally, as if acknowledging a colleague rather than someone he had shared a life with for years. That single gesture carried more distance than anything he had ever said out loud. Mark Sullivan began the meeting by stating that this session was a formal governance alignment confirmation intended to resolve remaining inconsistencies in authority mapping and finalize structural clarity across executive operations. The wording sounded procedural, but I had learned by now that procedural language in corporate environments often meant irreversible decisions presented in neutral packaging. Robert Hayes then spoke, sliding a thick folder onto the center of the table, explaining that during the final compliance audit, discrepancies had been identified between documented ownership records and operational execution authority across multiple divisions of the company. I listened carefully, noticing how often the word clarity was being used instead of words like removal or loss, because language had clearly become part of the structure that was controlling the narrative. When the legal representative began reading, the tone shifted slightly, becoming more precise, more formal, referencing internal verification results, shareholder validation processes, and executive authority consolidation outcomes. It was then that I heard my name appear in a classification I did not recognize, not as an executive contributor, not as a department head, but as a transitional stakeholder under review, pending final confirmation of controlling interest validation. I remember leaning forward slightly and asking for clarification, and for a brief moment the room did not respond, not because they did not know the answer, but because they were deciding how much of it to reveal at once. Jason finally spoke, and his voice was steady but distant, explaining that certain internal agreements signed months earlier had triggered a necessary restructuring of ownership definitions, and that what I had believed to be operational authority had always been subject to final verification protocols. I looked at him directly when he said that, searching for any sign that this was being said under pressure or confusion, but what I saw instead was someone who had already mentally accepted a version of reality that no longer included uncertainty. Robert then confirmed that effective immediately, all executive decision rights previously associated with my role would be centralized under the governance committee until full validation was completed. The phrase "until full validation" sounded temporary, but in systems like this, temporary often meant indefinite. I asked if this meant I had no authority within my own position anymore, and Mark responded carefully that my role remained active within title classification, but execution privileges were currently suspended as part of compliance review. That distinction between title and authority felt like the most important sentence I had ever heard inside that building, because it separated identity from function in a way I had not been prepared for. Jason did not look at me while I processed this, instead focusing on the documents in front of him, as if maintaining eye contact would imply emotional involvement in something he had already decided was structural rather than personal. When I asked him directly if he had known this was coming, there was a pause longer than any previous silence between us, and when he finally answered, he said that he had been informed of potential restructuring scenarios but had not been part of final execution decisions. The answer was technically careful, but emotionally absent. The meeting concluded shortly after, with Robert stating that further communication would be provided once the verification process reached completion, and that all parties should continue normal operations within adjusted access parameters. I left the room without speaking, walking through the hallway in a state that felt increasingly detached from the building itself, as if I was moving through a space that was still familiar in structure but no longer aligned with my presence. Back in my office, I attempted once more to access internal systems, only to find additional restrictions had been applied. This time, removing visibility into executive dashboards entirely, replacing them with summarized reports that no longer allowed interaction. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, realizing that what I had been experiencing was not sudden exclusion, but a carefully structured transition, where each step had been small enough to dismiss individually, but complete enough to be irreversible when viewed as a whole. That evening, when I returned home, Jason was already there, sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing documents in silence. I asked him one final time what was really happening, and this time his response was slower, almost resigned, as if he had reached the point where explanation no longer mattered. He said that the company was finalizing its governance correction process and that everything would stabilize once the review was complete, but his tone no longer carried reassurance, only distance. And as I stood there listening, I realized that the most unsettling part was not what had been taken from me, but the fact that everyone else in my life had already adjusted to a version of reality where I was no longer the person I thought I was inside the system I had helped build. The morning everything finally broke open felt strangely normal at first, almost too normal, as if the world itself had decided to disguise a turning point inside routine behavior so no one would notice it until it was too late to undo anything. I arrived at Hayes Corporation just before 9 o'clock, carrying the same posture I had carried for years, the same rhythm of walking through glass doors, greeting security, and stepping into an elevator that no longer felt like it was taking me toward a place of authority, but toward a space that was gradually rewriting my presence inside it. When I reached the executive floor, I immediately noticed something different in the way people moved. Not rushed, not tense, but deliberately neutral. Like everyone had already been informed of something I had not yet been fully told. Emily Brooks did not look up when I passed her desk, and that alone was enough to make my steps slow for half a second, because Emily always acknowledged me, even during the weeks when things had started changing. I continued walking until I reached my office, but instead of entering immediately, I saw Mark Sullivan waiting just outside the door, holding a sealed envelope with my name printed on the front, in formal corporate formatting. He handed it to me without speaking at first, then said there was a final confirmation document that required my immediate review as part of governance closure procedures. The word closure landed differently in my mind than any of the other procedural terms I had heard over the past weeks, because closure does not imply transition, it implies completion. Inside the envelope were printed documents outlining what was labeled as Final Authority Reconciliation across Hayes Corporation executive structure, and as I read the first page, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, not from shock alone, but from recognition that everything I had experienced before this moment had been leading here without interruption. Jason was already inside my office when I entered, sitting in the chair across from my desk, as if he had been waiting for me, not urgently, but inevitably. He looked up when I entered, and for a brief moment, there was something in his expression that almost resembled hesitation, but it disappeared quickly, replaced again by that controlled neutrality I had come to recognize as emotional distance masked as professionalism. I asked him directly if he knew what was in the document Mark had just given me, and he did not deny it, but instead said that it was part of the final stage of structural alignment that had been under discussion for some time. He spoke carefully, as if each word had already been reviewed for accuracy within a system larger than the conversation we were having. I opened the document fully and read further, and that was when I saw it clearly, the section that redefined controlling interest validation results, listing final confirmation of ownership authority under a name that did not appear where I expected it to. My name was referenced, but not as active controller, not as executive authority, but as transitional historical stakeholder pending final system integration review. I looked up slowly, and the silence between Jason and me stretched longer than anything we had experienced in years of marriage. I asked him what this meant in practical terms, and he answered without emotion that it meant executive authority had been centralized under governance confirmation pending completion of compliance verification cycles. It sounded procedural, but the impact of those words was absolute, because authority is not theoretical in environments like this. It is functional, and once it is removed, nothing else remains stable. I stood there for a moment trying to understand how something I had signed, participated in, and led decisions within could now be classified as something pending verification rather than active control. Jason finally spoke again, quieter this time, saying that he knew this would be difficult to process, but that it was necessary for legal and structural integrity of the organization. I remember asking him if he understood what it felt like to be present inside a system that no longer recognized your decisions, and he paused long enough for me to realize that he was not answering from misunderstanding, but from distance. He said that he believed everything would stabilize once the process was complete, but his tone no longer carried reassurance, only acceptance of something already concluded. After he left my office, I sat alone for a long time, reading the same sections of the document repeatedly, each time hoping I had misunderstood a sentence that never changed no matter how many times I read it. Later that afternoon, I was called to a final clarification meeting with Robert Hayes, Mark Sullivan, and the legal representative, and when I entered the room, I immediately understood that this was not a discussion, but a formalization of an outcome that had already been internally agreed upon. Robert spoke first, stating that the governance review had reached its final determination, and that operational authority within Hayes Corporation would be fully centralized under the Executive Compliance Board effective immediately. There was no tension in his voice, only procedural completion, as if he was announcing the end of a financial quarter rather than the end of a professional identity. The legal representative then confirmed that all historical documentation had been reviewed and that classification adjustments were now legally binding within corporate governance structure. I asked if there was any scenario in which my previous authority would be restored, and Mark responded carefully that restoration was not part of the current framework, only verification of status classification moving forward. Jason sat silently through most of this, and when he finally spoke, it was not to challenge or support, but to acknowledge that the transition had been expected within executive planning discussions. When the meeting ended, I left the room without argument, because argument requires presence in a system that still recognizes your voice, and I was beginning to understand that I no longer existed inside that category in the same way I once did. As I walked through the hallway, I passed employees who once reported directly to me, but none of them stopped, not out of disrespect, but out of uncertainty about whether engagement still applied. Back in my office, I turned off my computer for the first time in years without planning my next task, and in that silence I realized the most important truth of all, which was that nothing had collapsed suddenly. Nothing had been stolen overnight. Instead, I had been slowly reclassified out of power, while remaining fully visible inside a system that had already finished redefining who I was, long before I was informed. The final meeting was not loud, not dramatic, and not chaotic, but it carried a weight that felt heavier than anything I had experienced so far, because it no longer dealt with uncertainty or transition, it dealt with completion. I was called back into the same executive conference room on the 14th floor, the same space where everything had started to shift weeks earlier, except now the atmosphere no longer felt like a negotiation, or even a discussion. It felt like the final page of a document already signed, in places I had not been allowed to see. Robert Hayes sat at the head of the table with the same calm expression he always used when decisions had already been finalized. Mark Sullivan sat to his right with a folder aligned perfectly in front of him, and the legal representative was again present, this time with multiple sealed documents arranged in a precise stack that suggested formality rather than uncertainty. Jason was also there, but unlike before, he was not positioned beside me or even near me, instead seated across the table in alignment with the executive side, and that simple change in placement told me more than anything anyone had said so far. I remember sitting down and immediately noticing that no one offered preface or easing language because there was nothing left to soften. Robert spoke first, stating that the governance verification process had reached its final determination and that all structural authority assignments within Hayes Corporation had been formally resolved according to compliance validation outcomes. His tone was unchanged, steady, and procedural, but the meaning behind his words was absolute. Because resolution in corporate language often means final separation rather than clarification. Mark then opened the central folder and began referencing specific pages, pointing out finalized classifications, updated ownership mapping, and confirmed executive authority centralization under the Corporate Governance Board. Each phrase was delivered without emotion, but each one removed another layer of what I thought I still had. I listened carefully, trying to locate the version of reality I had been operating under for years, but it no longer aligned with anything being presented in front of me. When the legal representative spoke, the language became even more formal, referencing compliance closure, validation completion, and legal recognition of finalized structural hierarchy, confirming that all previous ambiguity had been officially resolved within corporate documentation. That was when I asked the question directly, asking whether my role had been removed entirely or simply reclassified, and the room paused in a way that made it clear the answer had already been agreed upon before I entered. Robert responded with calm precision, explaining that my position remained listed within historical corporate records, but that operational authority, decision-making capacity, and executive influence had been fully centralized and were no longer assigned at the individual contributor level. The distinction between presence and power was now fully separated in a way that could not be reversed by interpretation. Jason finally spoke after that, and when he did, his voice carried no emotion and only acceptance of structure. He said that the transition had been necessary for organizational integrity and that all parties involved had been informed through appropriate executive channels. I looked at him directly when he said that, searching for any trace of personal recognition or shared history, but what I saw instead was someone who had already positioned himself entirely within the new structure rather than outside of it with me. I asked him if he understood what it meant to stand beside someone while their authority was being systematically removed in front of them, and he did not answer immediately, not because he lacked words, but because the question itself did not exist within the framework he was currently operating inside. When he finally responded, he said that understanding was not the purpose of governance alignment, only execution and stability were. That sentence created a silence in the room that felt final, rather than temporary. After the meeting ended, no one followed me out, no one attempted reassurance, and no one offered explanation beyond what had already been formally documented. I walked through the hallway of Hayes Corporation slowly, noticing how the environment remained unchanged while my position within it had completely dissolved. People still worked at their desks, meetings still continued behind glass doors, and phones still rang with operational urgency, but none of it included me anymore in any functional sense. When I reached my office, I found that my system access had been reduced to archival viewing only, meaning I could observe past projects but no longer interact with active ones. I sat down for a long time without speaking, looking at my screen, realizing that even my digital presence had been carefully preserved in a way that allowed visibility without influence. That evening, I returned home and Jason was already there, sitting at the table with a stack of printed documents, not waiting for a conversation, but preparing for closure. I asked him one final time whether any part of what I had built still existed in practice, and he paused before answering that the company had moved into a new phase of governance, and that roles had been redefined to reflect structural accuracy. There was no conflict in his voice, only distance, as if he had fully accepted a version of reality where my loss of authority was not an event but a completed adjustment. I stood there for a long moment, realizing that nothing had been taken in a single moment. Nothing had been destroyed in a visible collapse. Instead, everything had been slowly reassigned, reclassified, and redefined until I remained present only as a reference point inside a system that no longer required my participation to function. And in that silence, I finally understood that the most complete form of removal is not being erased, but being kept visible while no longer being allowed to matter. I did not sleep that night, not because I was panicked in the way people expect during collapse, but because my mind had finally reached a state where denial was no longer physically possible, and every memory began reorganizing itself into something I could no longer avoid seeing clearly. I sat at the kitchen table long after Jason went to bed, staring at the dim light reflecting off my laptop screen, scrolling through internal records that I still had partial access to, not because the system trusted me, but because history is never fully deleted, only reclassified. Every document I opened now felt different, not because the content had changed, but because I was finally reading it without the illusion that I still had influence over it. There were governance logs, approval trails, and structural updates stretching back months, each one small on its own, each one seemingly routine, but together forming a pattern that I could no longer ignore. My name appeared again and again, not in leadership roles, not in decision authority, but in transition states, approvals pending, validations under review, permissions temporarily adjusted, phrases that sounded harmless individually, but formed something absolute when placed in sequence. At some point, I stopped reading like an executive and started reading like an outsider, trying to understand how long they had been standing outside without noticing the door had already closed. Around 3 a.m, Jason came downstairs, and for a moment he stopped when he saw me still awake, not surprised, but quietly acknowledging the reality he had been avoiding discussing directly. He asked me why I was still looking at work systems, and I told him I was trying to understand when exactly I stopped being part of my own company. He did not answer immediately, instead sitting down across from me in silence that felt heavier than any conversation we had had in weeks. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, almost rehearsed, saying that I was still part of the organization, just not in the operational structure anymore, as if that distinction carried meaning that could soften the reality of what had happened. I remember asking him directly if he knew this outcome was inevitable, and for the first time, he did not redirect the question or soften the answer. He said he had known that governance realignment was being discussed for some time, and that he had been informed of potential restructuring scenarios, but not the final execution timeline. That distinction mattered less than the fact that he had already been inside a version of the truth I was only now being allowed to see. The next morning, I returned to the office earlier than usual, not because I expected change, but because I needed to understand the environment in daylight rather than through the lens of uncertainty. The building felt the same, but my perception of it no longer matched its function. I walked past reception, past familiar desks, past meeting rooms where I had once led discussions that now continued without my presence being required or even anticipated. When I reached my office, I found a new notice waiting on my desk, printed on formal letterhead, stating that my role classification had been updated to non-executive historical contributor status, pending final system reconciliation. The language was clinical, almost gentle, but the meaning was absolute. I tried logging into the executive system again, and this time the access denied message was immediate, without delay or partial loading, as if even the system had stopped pretending I was temporarily restricted rather than permanently removed. I sat back and realized something that felt more final than anger or sadness, which was the understanding that the system had never been malfunctioning. It had been operating exactly as intended the entire time. Around midday, Mark Sullivan requested a final clarification meeting, but this time it was not on the executive floor. It was in a lower-level conference room that I had rarely used before, and that alone communicated more than any formal statement could have. When I entered, Robert was not present. Only Mark, the legal representative, and Jason. There was no folder this time, no documents being introduced for review, only a single printed statement already signed by multiple authorities that confirmed final governance closure for my operational role within Hayes Corporation. Mark explained calmly that all remaining administrative ties had been resolved and that my access would transition to archival status permanently, meaning I could review historical contributions but would no longer participate in any active decision systems. I asked if this meant there was no path back, no restoration, no reconsideration process, and the legal representative answered simply that the governance structure had already been finalized and could not be reversed without full board restructuring, which was not under consideration. Jason did not speak during most of this exchange, but when I looked at him, I saw no conflict in his expression, only acceptance of something that had already been mentally completed long before this meeting occurred. When I finally asked him if he understood what it felt like to be present in a system where your history still exists, but your influence does not, he hesitated briefly before saying that he understood it as structural necessity rather than personal loss. That sentence confirmed something I had been resisting accepting, which was that he had already moved into a version of reality where my removal was not emotional but procedural. After the meeting ended, I did not return to my office. I walked out of the building slowly, noticing how nothing around me reacted to my departure. No interruption, no acknowledgement, no pause in ongoing operations. The company continued functioning exactly as it always had, but I was no longer part of the sequence that made decisions possible inside it. That evening, I returned home, and Jason was already there, sitting at the table, reviewing final documents related to internal transition summaries. He looked up when I entered but did not stand, and I realized then that even at home, we were no longer operating inside the same version of continuity. I asked him one last time if he ever considered telling me earlier, before everything reached this point, and he said quietly that he believed the process had been handled properly through corporate channels. There was no apology, no explanation beyond structure, only the finality of a system that had already completed its work without needing emotional permission from anyone involved. And in that moment, I understood the most irreversible truth of all, which was that I had not been removed in an instant. I had been gradually absorbed into a classification system that preserved my existence while permanently removing my ability to affect anything within it. After everything ended, there was no celebration of victory, no dramatic sense of revenge, only a quiet emptiness that slowly turned into something softer, something closer to peace than anything I had felt in a very long time. I left Hayes Corporation the next morning without a meeting, without a badge that mattered, and without anyone asking me to stay, because by then my presence inside the system had already been reduced to something historical rather than active. The city outside looked the same, but I no longer moved through it as someone carrying invisible pressure on her shoulders. For the first time in years, I was not checking emails every 10 minutes, not waiting for approval, not measuring my worth through responses that never came on time. Jason and I did not fight loudly. There was no final explosion, only a long silence that eventually separated into two different directions of life. He remained inside the structure that had defined him, while I stepped out of it without fully knowing what would replace it, only knowing that I could no longer return to a place where my voice existed without influence. In the weeks that followed, I started waking up without that familiar weight in my chest, the one that used to remind me of unfinished decisions and unresolved approvals. I began walking in the mornings, sometimes without destination, just to feel what it meant to exist without urgency. It took time to understand that losing a role is not the same as losing identity, even though for a while those two things had felt identical. I thought about every moment when I ignored small signs, every time I accepted explanation instead of questioning structure, and I realized that trust without clarity slowly becomes a way of disappearing while still being visible. What I learned from everything that happened was not bitterness, but awareness. The understanding that value is not defined by how loudly a system includes you, but by whether that system can exist without taking away your voice in the process. I also learned that silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is just absence waiting to be recognized. If you are listening to this, and you have ever felt slowly pushed out of your own life, or quietly erased from spaces where you once mattered, I want you to know that your intuition is not confusion. It is often the first signal that something is shifting before it becomes visible. Do not ignore it. Protect your boundaries, protect your clarity, and protect your ability to ask questions even when everyone else seems comfortable not asking them. There is a kind of strength in stepping back before you are completely removed, and there is a different kind of strength in walking away when staying would cost you your sense of self. And if you are healing from something similar, be patient with yourself, because understanding often arrives after the pain, not before it. Sometimes life removes you from systems not to punish you, but to return you to yourself. And even if it does not feel like it at first, that return can become the beginning of something quieter, steadier, and more honest than what came before. I still think about that version of my life sometimes, not with anger, but with distance, like remembering a place I once lived in but no longer belong to. And maybe that is what healing really is, not forgetting what happened, but no longer letting it define where you go next. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. Thank you for listening with patience and heart. And if this story spoke to you in any way, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories like this, because sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that stay with us the longest. My name is Olivia Carter. I am 32 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave you with is this: your value does not disappear just because someone else stops recognizing it.